Okay, everybody. I apologize at the beginning for my voice. As you probably noticed from class today, I have a cold, so hopefully it doesn't get in the way too much of the information in here. Remember, you should watch this by Thursday's class. If for some reason we do not have school on Wednesday, you should watch this by Friday's class. But either way, it's going to be important that by the end of the week you've watched this, you've come to class with questions about it. As I mentioned in class today, we're going to have a test on the wars of the 20th century, so World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, and this will be a key part of it. So it may make sense as you do this to take notes on it, fill out a warfare analysis chart, and definitely come to class with any questions you have, because the material in here is very important for understanding World War II, the Holocaust, and the Cold War, which we'll be talking about over the next 2 weeks. Throughout the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s in Europe, the different countries of Europe were engaged in imperialism. We talked about that in the American context for the last week and a half or so. In the European context, that meant a series of alliances were formed. So the different major governments within Europe had sort of chosen sides almost, and they had backed signed a series of treaties with each other that they would defend each other in the context of any aggression by those on the other side. This had a lot to do with the way that they were carving up the world in terms of their alliances, and it is an important little backstory to what actually happens. In 1914, the Archduke of Austria. Austria today is a very small country in Europe, German-speaking, but at the time Austria was a very large empire that included everything that would today be, the former Yugoslavia, Hungary, parts of Poland, parts of Czechoslovakia. All of that was within this country called Austria. Franz Ferdinand was the Archduke. He was heir to the throne of Austria. And he went and, with his wife, was visiting Sarajevo, which was a city in what is today Bosnia, recently had been conquered by the Austrians. And there was a lot of tension between the Austrians and the Serbians. They were different religiously. Austrians were Roman Catholic, Serbians were Orthodox. They'd fought over territory in Bosnia for about 800 years or so, on and off. And a group of Serbian terrorists that called themselves the Black Hand. They assassinate Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo in 1914. They actually tried to assassinate him 3 times that day. The first 2 times were unsuccessful, and the third time they do actually shoot him. And that doesn't really seem like it should be that important of an event, right? Members of royal families had been assassinated before, but because of the alliances that had formed in Europe, this one event has a chain reaction effect. When Austria declares war on Serbia because the Serbians won't turn over the assassins, Russia is obligated by its treaties to declare war on Austria. Austria had signed a treaty with Germany that in the event of Russia attacking Austria, Germany would be required to go to war with Russia. So Germany would then declare war on Russia. France had signed a treaty with Russia that if Germany declared war on Russia, France would defend Russia and declare war on Germany. So thus, France gets involved too. Eventually, Britain will get involved. And by the fall of 1914, all of the countries in Europe, all the major countries in Europe, are involved in this war that's about something that really didn't affect any of them. But they all get pulled in because of this alliance system that had been created around the issues of imperialism. The Americans try very, very hard not to get involved in this war. World War I begins in 1914. It goes on through 1915, 1916, into 1917, and the United States is not involved. President Woodrow Wilson, when he was running for re-election in 1916, ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The American people were very much supporting isolationism and staying out of this war, especially as the war really gets bogged down and is killing millions and millions of people. There are 2 events that pull the United States into the war. The first is the sinking of a ship called the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a passenger ship, and it was taking Americans and other European citizens across the Atlantic Ocean when it was off the coast of Ireland, sunk by a German submarine, killed a number of innocent people, over 1,000 actually, and many of them were Americans. And the Germans said that they sunk the ship because it had explosives in the hull that were being smuggled to the British to help them fight the war against the Germans. There might be some truth to that, as when torpedoes hit the boat, it exploded, didn't just sink. But either way, if the Americans were smuggling these weapons to the British on the ship, there were still a lot of innocent civilians who were on the ship that got killed by the Germans making the decision to attack it. And this causes a lot of outrage in the United States, because they feel like we're not involved in the war and Germany attacked us. The second and more bizarre cause of America's involvement in World War I is something called the Zimmermann Note. An ambassador from Germany to Mexico wrote a secret telegram that said to Mexico, you should declare war on the United States and fight them to keep them busy so that they will not join the war in Europe. And the argument was that if the Mexicans attacked the United States and kept them busy in the Western Hemisphere, that when the war was over, Mexico would be given back the land that we took from them at the end of the Mexican-American War. Mexico doesn't really want any part of this, and the British intercept the telegram and put it in the newspaper. And as you can imagine, when Americans read in their newspapers that the Germans are trying to get other countries to declare war on us, American public opinion is outraged. And by the end of 1917, we will declare war on Germany and join World War I. Before we get into how the war was fought, a couple of quick things about how this war changes the United States. This is a huge opportunity for women who had been denied access to working outside the home, at least in certain kinds of jobs, denied access to working outside of the home. When the men are overseas fighting, women pick up jobs in factories and working in industrial labor that would have previously been denied to them. This gives women an opportunity and a taste of what some of these jobs were like. And even though they largely lose those positions when the men come back from the war, when the war is over, it's sort of a kickoff of the women's rights movement. Remember that just 1 year, 1920, after the end of World War I, women are going to gain suffrage and the right to vote, in part because of the way that they perform in supporting the country during the tough times during World War I. The second and very, very, very important development that comes out of World War I is the Great Migration. After slavery ends at the end of the Civil War, many African Americans still live in the South. As white men go off to fight in Europe during World War I, jobs become available in northern cities. And about 1.5 million African Americans, not all within the couple years of World War I, but World War I kind of accelerates this movement. Millions of African Americans move from the South to the North to take jobs in northern cities. And in a city like Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Detroit and New York and Chicago, which had relatively small African American populations prior to World War I, really the black population booms and thousands of people move north. And this changes the makeup of northern cities. With larger African American populations, you get more conflict around segregation, you get more movements for African American rights. These African Americans oftentimes are given the right to vote in northern cities, which changes their political involvement. So really, it's like the civil rights movement grows out of this. It's hard to imagine how important this is for the country's history, especially with the country's history with regard to race. Another really interesting and important thing that happens in World War I is called the Selective Services Act. The government formalizes the draft to get men to go fight, because this war was not initially popular. And that still exists today. So as I think we've talked about in class before, men in the United States today, because of a law from World War I, are required to register for the draft, even though we don't have one, in the event that one could be needed and come up in the future. Those are just three of the major changes that take place for people in the United States, not necessarily those that go off to fight. To give you a sense of the fighting in World War I, you had two sides. You had the Allied powers and you had the Central powers. The Central powers were called Central because they mostly were located in the center of Europe. Germany is the largest. Austria-Hungary is its main ally. The Ottoman Empire, which is currently Turkey and the Middle East, was a third and much weaker part of the Central Powers. Against the Central Powers were the Allies. Britain and France are the largest. Italy changes sides in the middle of the war and becomes an ally. It had previously been a Central Power. It does not play a large role in the war. Russia is on the Allied side until the middle of the war, when they have a Bolshevik revolution and drop out. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And as I said, the United States will join on the Allied side in 1918 with only 2 years left in the war. World War I is a very good example of total war. We've talked about that war in the context of the Civil War. All of society is involved in this war. Everyone is mobilized. Everyone is sacrificing to help support the troops on the front. When we talk about the front in the context of the Americans fighting, almost all the fighting takes place on a line in eastern France and western Germany. There were a large and complex series of trenches that were built, and most of the fighting in World War I took place in these trenches. You can see this picture there of what these trenches would look like. These trenches were hundreds of miles in length. Men lived in these trenches for extended periods of time in the winter, in the rain. And the way the fighting would take place was when your commander told you to go, you would jump out of the trench and run to try to take over the other side's trench, which might be 100 yards or so away. It was a really, really brutal way of fighting, and it was particularly brutal because of the new technology that had been invented between the Civil War and World War I. In trench warfare, there were a number of new technologies that made this fighting really, really brutal. Machine guns had been invented, so now you could shoot hundreds of bullets very quickly, and that allowed the defenders, the people in the trench, to cut down whole lines of soldiers who were charging to try to capture them. This is the first war where airplanes are used, so you not only have bombs being dropped out of airplanes, but you also have airplanes getting into fights, shooting at each other in the sky. Barbed wire, which had been invented to keep cattle from moving, excuse me, is used extensively in this war. If you place barbed wire in between the trenches, it slows down the people who are trying to attack your trench and makes it much, much easier for you to shoot them, since they can't just run through at top speed. Tanks are used in this war for the first time. The Germans invent poison gas to be used in this war, so they use chemical warfare. We'll talk more about this in class and how this was used, but all of these new technologies make this war incredibly deadly, and neither side is strong enough to push through the other's lines. So they just send, year after year, waves of men against each other's trenches. And you're getting millions and millions and millions of people killed until eventually countries are literally running out of men who are between certain age ranges. When the war is over, up to 10 million people will have died in the fighting. The year after the war ends, everyone is so malnourished, and all of Europe, because of the fighting. An outbreak of something called the Spanish flu will take place and kill another 10 million people. So there are major, major population consequences in Europe because of this fighting. Essentially what happens is that the Germans give up. The war is fought to an armistice. Armistice is a temporary ceasefire. What happens is the Germans went through a winter in 1918 to 1919, without any food. In Germany, it's called the turnip winter because that was all people had to eat was turnips. There was no other food. There were blockades being done of the German coastline, and because of the war effort, the Germans were just utterly exhausted. The Emperor of Germany, who was called the Kaiser, he gives up the throne and flees the country because he realizes that the people are just cannot continue fighting, and they flee. And Germany is given a new democracy. It's called the Weimar Republic. So Germany, for the first time in its history, will be a democracy. The other big thing that comes out of the war is that Russia will have a revolution, and you learned about this quite a bit with Mrs. Kashubik last year, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But because Russia was so exhausted during the war, communism will take over in Russia, turned it into the Soviet Union. And that obviously will have long-term consequences on world history, as that will be one of the major enemies of the United States during the Cold War. The World War I is officially ended at the Treaty of Versailles. Normally we're used to a Treaty of Paris. If you know anything about Paris, the King's Palace outside of the city is called Versailles. That was where they signed this treaty. So it's really a Treaty of Paris. It's just like it was in a suburb of Paris. They called it Versailles. At the Treaty of Paris, the major world powers, leaders of the major world countries, United States, Italy, France, Great Britain, are there and are forcing a hard line on the Germans. The Germans were so weakened as the war ended, they could literally not continue to fight. They had a new government. So every time at the peace conference, the Allied powers would push on the Germans and drive a hard bargain, and the Germans would say, we can't accept that. The Allies would say, that's fine, let's start fighting again. And Germany couldn't afford that. So Germany essentially gives in on everything. And one of the major issues with the Treaty of Versailles is it blames the entire war on Germany, even though Germany was not the only country to blame. It had a very major role to play, was not the only country to blame. So in the Treaty of Versailles, it specifically says that Germany was at fault for the war. It specifically says that Germany is required to pay millions of dollars in reparations. You can see the word repair in there. They were repairing the other countries. Germany was going to lose territory. And if you look at the map on previously, I'll go back and look at it for 1 second. Germany had included all of this land here that was Poland, all of the land here that's the light purple, pink, and yellow. It gave all of that land up. Notice that there are two chunks of German territory that are not connected, and Poland is created in the middle. That'll be important for World War II. So Germany is humiliated, blamed for the war, forced to pay reparations, loses lots of territory. Essentially what you have is the side that quote-unquote won the war, and they really just outlasted the Germans. They didn't actually win. They won the war by they're trying to fix their problems by punishing Germany. And as we'll see, that is actually a very, very bad decision on their part, because that's going to lead to World War II. After World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, Germany, in this new government it has called the Weimar Republic, is incredibly weak. And Germans, who had been one of the strongest countries in the world before this point, are upset and devastated at how weak they've become in the context of this war. There's Germans who repeatedly talk about being stabbed in the back, that the country would have won World War I if it had not been stabbed in the back. You hear this term over and over again in German newspapers, in German speeches, and the implication is that it's minority groups within Germany that have sabotaged it and caused it to lose World War I. There's no truth to this, but people like Hitler are going to come to power and use this myth, this stabbed in the back myth, to blame the Jews and other minority groups within Germany and say it's their fault and that's why we lost World War I. If only they'd fought more and helped out, maybe we would have won. Because the German government is spending so much of its money paying debts, Germany has massive inflation. Inflation like no country has ever seen since. The value of the money is going down so quickly that people get paid in Germany twice a day. You know, today we would get paid once a week or once every other week. They get paid twice a day. And people go out and spend their money before they go back to work because the money is so worthless. As prices go up because of inflation, you have to spend it quickly or it doesn't have any value. All of this has a major blow to German nationalism. The Germans are upset. They feel like their country has been weakened, and they don't really know why, and they're not used to it, and they don't appreciate it. And the situation that's created here with Germany feeling bad for itself, looking for a way out of its massive problems, creates the perfect scenario for someone like Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was an Austrian, not a German. He was a veteran of World War I. After the war, he is a member of a minor party in Germany called the National Socialists. If I was going to say National Socialists in German, the first letters or the sounds of the word national is na, and the first sound of the word socialist is C. So Nazi is actually an abbreviation in German for National Socialist. Okay, Hitler is a very gifted speaker. That is the thing that really helps him come to prominence. He's a fantastic speaker. He knows how to rile up an audience. And he tells the Germans exactly what they wanted to hear. He tells them that, yeah, your life is pretty bad right now, but you're the master race. You're the best. And I'm going to help you to get back to where you were. When people are depressed and in a bad situation, they're willing to listen to promises and not ask a lot of questions. And that's exactly what the Germans did. They bought into what Hitler was selling without really asking how we were going to get there. Okay, Hitler talks repeatedly about this term Lebensraum, which means living space, that Germany just needed space to grow and expand. Nobody bothered to ask the question, where is this space going to come from? Obviously, it comes at the expense of other countries. And in order to get the living space, you need to clear off the land, the people who currently live there, like Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, other people, with handicaps, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, all these people that he considered to not be part of the master race, and the groups that helped to stab the country in the back in World War II, in World War I, excuse me. And one of the things that I think is the most important thing you can know about Adolf Hitler, and this will be where the PowerPoint ends and sort of is the transition to World War II. Hitler was a dictator, but Hitler did not take over Germany. I have to say that again because it is so important. Hitler did not take over Germany. Hitler was elected as the leader of Germany. In 1933, the National Socialists won 37% of the vote. Remember, Germany is a multi-party system. That means they got the largest percent of the vote. They formed a coalition. Hitler becomes the chancellor, which is their equivalent of president. And by March, they decide they don't need to have any more elections. But what this shows us is that the German people liked what Hitler was saying, and they approved of his policies before he came to power. That's very important because sometimes we get the impression that, World War II is about this one crazy evil guy and his awful ideas of how he's going to exterminate Jews and do other horrible things. That is not true. The German people, not all of them, but many of them, supported his policies and voted for him. And I think if you understand that fact, the Holocaust makes a little bit more sense. And it's a very important detail for those of us who want to make sure that we never have anything like that happen in our world again today. There's a lot of information to chew over. Please come to class with questions. And I look forward to talking to you guys about World War I and World War II in the coming weeks.